Welcome to A Kind Life. Today I'm extremely grateful to be joined by Peter Hammarstedt. How are you going, Peter?
I'm good. Thank you, Alicia. I'm honored to be part of your show. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, my absolute pleasure. I'm really excited. This is actually going to air as the 100th episode of A Kind Life podcast. And I was really excited to have such an incredible guest on to share your personal journey and also your involvement with Sea Shepherd as the Director of Campaigns for Sea Shepherd Global. So thank you so much.
Well, if it's the 100th episode, then I'm especially honored, and a big congratulations to you. 100 episodes is a big deal.
Thank you. So I guess I'm really keen to learn about when you first joined Sea Shepherd. Like, tell us how you ever became interested.
The reason I got involved in Sea Shepherd in the first place is because I got involved in animal rights, and I would probably never have joined Sea Shepherd if I hadn't first become vegetarian and then later vegan. So when I was about 14 years old, two life-changing events occurred. Firstly, I saw a picture of a dead Minke whale being pulled up the slipway of this 8,000-ton factory whaling ship down in the Southern Ocean, and I just could not believe that whaling was still happening. And around the same time, I went to a small school in eastern Pennsylvania in the United States, and there was only one girl in the school who was vegetarian. And when she told me about the plight of animals, I became vegetarian on the spot. I became vegan about 3 years later, which I guess is 21 years ago now. And I think it was the combination of those two things, seeing the image of whaling, combined with learning how animals are abused within animal industries across the board. And I just knew that I wanted to physically get involved in the fight for animal rights and the fight for conservation and environmental preservation. And as soon as I was old enough to submit an application to join Sea Shepherd, that's what I did.
It's pretty incredible. I'm guessing at that young age, it would have been like, I know myself, I was a similar age when I went vegetarian, but to go through, did you research or did she tell you about what happens with animals in animal agriculture?
I remember I was in Spanish class just before lunch period, and a bunch of kids were asking her those kind of outrageous questions that you're used to getting when you first become vegetarian or vegan. Like, if you were stuck on a deserted island, would you eat animal products, right? Those kind of silly hypotheticals. And I remember saying something incredibly ignorant that I'm deeply embarrassed of today, and saying something along the lines, they're just trying to take away our right to eat meat. And at the age of 14, this young woman held up a piece of A4 paper and said, I'm just trying to let people know that egg-laying chickens are held in cages no bigger than this piece of paper. And that visual just hit me like a sledgehammer across my chest. And I immediately sat down next to her and I said, wait, what are you talking about? She explained it to me, and I asked her, well, how do pigs have it? How do cows have it? By the time I got to lunch period, I opened up my brown paper bag that I'd packed for school lunch, and I just saw animal products in every single food item that I brought for my lunch, and I skipped lunch that day. And that's how it really started for me. I actually became vegan for the first 3 weeks, but then I was 14 years old and I was living at home, and it took moving out of my family home to go all the way.
Yeah, wow. And how did you learn about Sea Shepherd?
Well, I actually joined Greenpeace, and the image that I saw of this dead whale being pulled up the slipway of this factory whaling ship was actually a picture on a Greenpeace website. And in this image was a small inflatable boat with Greenpeace activists on board trying to disrupt the winching on board of this whale. And so I applied to join Greenpeace, and I later moved from the United States to Sweden, where I was born, and a Greenpeace ship visited the port of Stockholm, where I was living, and that gave me the opportunity to actually crew on board this Greenpeace ship. And around the same time, the neighboring country of Iceland had decided that they wanted to resume whaling after a 17-year hiatus. And there was a vote at the International Whaling Commission, which is the intergovernmental body that governs whaling worldwide. and Iceland was readmitted to the International Whaling Commission, which was a prerequisite to them whaling under the guise of so-called science. And it was my country of Sweden that cast the deciding vote that allowed Iceland to rejoin. It was 19 votes to 18. And what was so absurd is that the Swedish delegation literally pressed the wrong button during the vote. And when the Swedish delegation realized their mistake, they asked if it was possible to re-vote. That wasn't possible under the rules and regulations of this intergovernmental body. And I remember being 18 years old and thinking how absurd that now hundreds of whales are condemned to die because some government bureaucracy can't just take 3 minutes to vote again. Shortly thereafter, Greenpeace announced that they were going to send a ship to Iceland to do a public relations tour to turn public opinion against whaling, which was very important work. But at the same time, an organization that I had not heard of previously, Sea Shepherd, announced that they were heading to Iceland to use direct action to directly intervene. And that aspect of direct intervention, of direct action, that absolutely appealed to me. And I knew that's where I needed to be.
Yeah. And so how long have you been with Sea Shepherd now?
I've been with Sea Shepherd since 2003. So that's it's my 20-year anniversary this year. It means I've been with Sea Shepherd my entire adult life. I've more than half my natural life. And I remember making a coffee on the ship the other day and realizing that the only other job I've had in my life other than working for Sea Shepherd was as a barista when I was 15, 16, and 17, making coffees.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a huge part of your life, which is incredible. I'm guessing, before, I'm just a little bit intrigued, someone that is probably not the best on boats myself. Had you ever been on boats before you joined Greenpeace or Sea Shepherd, or was it a whole new experience for you?
A whole new experience for me. I was largely an urban kid. We moved around a lot when I was a child. So I grew up in Kuwait City and Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, Beijing, China, London, England, and until we finally moved to the United States. And I grew up outside of the city of Philadelphia. So no, I never grew up by the seaside. I didn't go sailing as a kid or diving. I just felt an affinity towards whales, and it just so happened that whales spent their time at sea. And if whales were land-based megafauna, then I probably would have never set foot on the heaving deck of a ship. I just had to go where the whales were.
Yeah. And tell us about that journey, I know when you started, you didn't obviously, you weren't a captain straight from the start. So tell us about that journey. I believe you started sort of below deck.
I started as an oiler in the engine room, which is essentially like an engineering assistant. And the first 5.5 months of my time with Sea Shepherd was spent in every single fuel tank on board the only ship that we owned at the time, a ship called the Farley Moat. And I remember still feeling like the luckiest person in the world, standing there ankle deep in diesel sludge, because I was getting this ship ready for campaign. And I was doing my part in helping this mission to happen. I later moved on to working on the deck department. I went up onto the bridge, and with a lot of sea time, with a lot of schooling, I was ultimately given command of the Sea Shepherd ship Bob Barker must have been nine years ago, something like that.
Yeah. Pretty incredible, as you said, from someone who'd never really stepped on a boat to then becoming a captain after all these years and then moving on. So tell us about the type of campaigns. I know you've been involved in, heavily involved, obviously, as you said, in whaling. That was a huge passion of yours, but also as well illegal fishing. So tell us about some of these campaigns.
Well, I spent more than 10 years chasing Japanese whaling ships down in the Southern Oceans. And I think that's the kind of campaign that probably Sea Shepherd supporters in Australia know Sea Shepherd for. And because of these successful interventions and because of the media attention and the awareness that these direct action campaigns generated in Australia, the Australian government and the New Zealand government ultimately took the government of Japan to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. the highest court in the world. And this court ultimately ruled that the whaling program down in the Antarctic was illegal, and that essentially shut down whaling in the Southern Ocean once and for all. With whaling finished in the Antarctic, we were able to pivot and focus on a different poaching issue facing the Antarctic, and that was the poaching of Patagonian and Antarctic toothfish, an apex predator in the Antarctic ecosystem. And my crew and I spent 110 days chasing a notorious poaching vessel called the Thunder, which was wanted by the International Criminal Police Organization, Interpol, that was on several international blacklists for almost 4 months across 3 oceans, covering 11,000 nautical miles, until the captain of the ship, unable to shake Sea Shepherd as his pursuer, decided to sink his own vessel to try to destroy the evidence on board. And that really led us into working on the issue of illegal fishing. And for me, for whom whaling was my issue of greatest passion, I came to learn that although Japan, Iceland, and Norway were together killing over 3,000 whales annually, over 300,000 whales and dolphins were being killed every single year through entanglement with fishing gear, which meant that over 100 times as many cetaceans were being killed because of fishing as opposed to direct whaling. And that was a very sobering realization. And I came to discover that whaling was not the root problem facing the world's oceans. Rather, whaling was symptomatic of a more problematic relationship that we have with the oceans. And so for the past 6-7 years, I've been focusing almost entirely on the fight against illegal fishing. And as an ethical vegan, I've discovered that in terms of being able to save as many lives as possible, there's no better way than getting illegal fishing vessels arrested, where every single day that one of these ships spends detained in port represents tens of thousands of lives saved. And so for me, every one of these vessels arrested is a slaughterhouse shut down.
And I guess just initially, like talking about whaling, I believe you were involved in a campaign which actually, I suppose, halted they didn't have the ability to refuel one of the ships that were the slaughterhouses that were out at sea, and that actually then stopped their ability to continue to be out at sea. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
On one of the campaigns in the Southern Ocean, we were very lucky to find the reef tanker that supplies the whaling fleet. The whaling fleet would go down for a 4.5 month period of time, and so they would have to refuel several times during the season. And so the strategy was that if we could find the refueling tanker and physically block any refueling effort, then the whaling fleet would have to suspend the whaling season and give up and head back home to port. We were very lucky one year in particular. We found the refueling tanker very early on in the whaling season, and my crew and I blocked this 8,000-ton factory whaling ship, the same vessel that I had seen a picture of when I was 14, the same vessel that had haunted my dreams as a kid. We placed our ship, the Bob Barker, between this 8,000-ton floating slaughterhouse and the 5,000-ton refueling tanker that was ready to receive them, and pushed our 500-ton vessel between the two, and basically told the captain of the factory whale ship that he would have to sink us to refuel. And in a 5-day engagement of us playing cat and mouse with this much larger vessel that towered over us like a 5-story building, a vessel that rammed us several times and tried to push us out of the way. They tried to test our resolve. We stood our ground for the whales, and the factory whaling ship abandoned its plans to refuel. And we physically escorted the whaling fleet out of the Southern Ocean Whale Sanctuary. And that was a year where the whaling fleet fell short of their quota by 90%. And we saved 932 whales that year by standing our ground. And that's something that I'm incredibly proud of.
Absolutely. I could only imagine. And, I've seen some of the photos. It looked, or photos and video, it looked so like, as you said, your boat was your ship was so small compared to the two surrounding you. Was that for you? Did you feel like, was that one of the most sort of dangerous things you've done as your time as Sea Shepherd?
I think looking back at it retroactively, it yeah, of course, it's hair raising, and what gave me and the other officers on board the confidence to go through with that action is that in the days leading up to this blocking attempt, I had a meeting with my crew, had 30 crew on board. We had another two Sea Shepherd vessels on the scene, and I said, "This is the plan. We're going to wedge our ship between these two much larger vessels, and we're all on the same boat, literally. And if this is something that you're not ready for, I completely understand. We can transfer you over to another one of the Sea Shepherd ships. You have 24 hours to think about it and to make your decision." And in less than 2 hours, every single crew member had gotten back to me, and every single crew member decided to stay on board the Bob Barker. So that's the kind of passion and commitment that I don't think you find anywhere else but with Sea Shepherd. And that certainly gave me the confidence, is that there were 30 of us who stood our ground, and I was just the person privileged enough to be entrusted with the helm.
Yeah. And also as well, I know a little bit, we actually had Ashka on a previous podcast who shared he was part of Operation Icefish, and he shared a lot of the detail around, like the length of the line that was pulled out, and, the work that went on to remove, to collect all that for evidence as well. But, I guess from your perspective, I'd be really interested to understand, like, yeah, what was going through your mind thinking, that you're just going to constantly stay at sea while you're trying to make sure that, yeah, Thunder didn't get away.
I'm so glad you mentioned Ashker, because as the Bob Barker was chasing the Thunder, the crew of the Sam Simon spent 3.5 weeks pulling up 72 kilometers of illegal gill net abandoned by the Thunder when we found them. And they were working 24 hours a day in the most difficult conditions imaginable at the bottom of the world, in frigid conditions, pulling up this invisible curtain of death. So there was really a 1-2 punch in shutting down the operations of the Thunder. There was the pursuing them to ensure that they wouldn't be able to resume their illegal fishing activity, but it was also removing this weapon of mass destruction out of the sea. And it was a combination of efforts from the Bob Barker and the Sam Simon, the two Sea Shepherd ships, that ultimately led to that campaign being successful. When we first found the Thunder, they first tried to lose us in the heavy ice floes that surround the Antarctic continent, but we were able to basically follow in the wake of the Thunder as they broke through the ice ahead of us. They then tried to lose us in the heavy weather that the Southern Oceans are renowned for, and 6-7 meter seas beat and battered the Bob Barker as we chased them north. And then they tried the third strategy, which was to test our patience and to try to wait us out. And for over a month and a half, we just drifted in uncertainty, not knowing when the chase would resume and for how long we could potentially drift for. And with the fuel calculations that I was able to make, had the Thunder drifted indefinitely, we could have potentially been out at sea for over 2 years. And that was a very sobering thought. And similar to what I mentioned before, Alicia, about the opportunity for crew to disembark onto another Sea Shepherd ship, when I knew that we could potentially be at sea for 2 years, we at least had the fuel to do it. I gathered the crew, the Sam Simon, the ship that Ashker was on its way up to Mauritius to hand over this net to the police authorities. And I said, there's an opportunity to transfer over to the Sam Simon, but if you stay on the Bob Barker, there's the possibility we could be out at sea for 2 years. There's no guarantee of outcome. We could, after 1 year of chasing this ship, we could have an engine breakdown that results in the Thunder getting away. After 2 years, we could follow them into port and our ship could be arrested and the Thunder simply let go. The only guarantee, the only thing I can promise is that every day that we're with this ship, they cannot fish. They will not fish. And so every day that we're with this ship, we are saving toothfish. And that has to be victory enough to be willing to stay. And again, I had around 30 crew, and out of 30 crew, 4 people did have to transfer to the Sam Simon for personal reasons, and but 26 out of the 30 decided to stay and sail into that great unknown of potentially being stuck on a ship for 2 years. And again, it's the kind of passion that inspires me on a daily basis. And when the campaigns get tough, when the opposition gets hard, I think back on those moments and realize that the opposition just doesn't have that kind of resolve that our volunteers exhibit time and time again.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible, the dedication, to think that people signed up and, just could be at sea for 2 years is, definitely takes a certain type of person or group of people. And so tell us about when you're, I guess, looking out the front of the ship and you start to see the Thunder sink like that. Yeah, that would have been, well, I think first of all, you would have heard that. I think they did a Mayday call or something like that. But that would have, just been something quite unexpected for what you would have been thinking was going to be an endless sort of, chase or sitting and waiting.
Everybody's favorite pastime on board the ship was to speculate how the chase would ultimately end. Nobody proposed as a possible conclusion was that the ship would sink. And I think a major reason for that is seafarers are superstitious folk by nature, and you're not allowed to say the word sink or sinking on board a ship. It's incredibly taboo. And so for that reason, I don't think anybody speculated that would be a potential outcome. But it was a strange sight to see this ship that I'd been staring at for 110 days disappear below the surface of the ocean, to know that this was a vessel that in its 10-year poaching career had made an illicit profit of about $60 million, and to know that it would never fish again, and to know that a small group of passionate and compassionate people was able to do what no government had been able to do, which was to shut down this ship. And no amount of seminars about illegal fishing, no amount of government policy to end illegal fishing had stopped them. What ultimately stopped them was a group of people that decided on a plan so simple that it had never been tried before, and that was to pull up their nets and follow them for however long it took until justice was brought.
Yeah.
A very surreal experience.
I can imagine. Yeah. And what's the longest time that you've been at sea for?
It would have had to have been the chase of the Thunder. And if we calculate the chase plus the amount of time it took to get down from Hobart to the Southern Ocean, where we ultimately found the Thunder after a couple of days of searching in the most remote stretch of water in the world. I spent about 130 days at sea straight without making landfall. And that would have to be the longest amount of time without going to port.
Yeah. And what would you say is like your most memorable or most proud moment of your time with Sea Shepherd?
I have to say that what we're doing now is what I'm most proud of. The fact that we're working with countries around the African continent to assist those countries to take back their seas from poachers makes me incredibly proud. And I think the results that we're delivering together with our country partners are largely unheard of in the conservation space and in the animal space. 4 years ago, we assisted the Liberian Coast Guard to arrest a ship called the Libico II, and this was a vessel that was legally licensed to fish for tuna using long line fishing gear. When they were boarded by the Liberian Coast Guard in West Africa, assisted by Sea Shepherd, we discovered that there wasn't a single tuna on board. There wasn't a single long line hook on board. Rather, this ship was using illegal deep sea gill nets to fish for endangered deep sea sharks to produce shark liver oil for the production of cosmetics. And looking at the cargo manifests on board this ship was every 18 days was delivering 50 tons of shark liver oil to the port of Dakar in Senegal. And to produce 50 tons of shark liver oil takes the lives of 66,000 deep sea sharks, which meant that this one ship on its own was killing 500,000 sharks every single year. And this vessel was arrested by the Liberian Coast Guard. 4 years have passed since then. The ship has not been out to sea since then. And that means that in one single action by the Liberian Coast Guard, supported by Sea Shepherds, supported by Sea Shepherds supporters around the world, especially in Australia, over 2 million sharks have been saved and counting. And even in the time we've spent on this podcast, even more sharks have been saved as a result, because that ship is still detained in port. That's the kind of success that I'm most proud of. I'm also proud because working with these governments allows us to not just fight for animals and not just save more animals than we've ever saved before, but to also protect marine protected areas, which are essentially like national parks at sea, which could be largely undefended at times because of their remoteness. So we're doing real important conservation work. And we're also fighting for social justice. And I remember you asked me, Alicia, what was the longest I'd spent at sea? And I said about 4 months, or just over 4 months. And last year I was in the Eastern Tropical Pacific off the Galapagos Islands together with a journalist from the Associated Press, and he was doing a big story about the Chinese squid fleet operating in the Pacific. And while we were with one of the 600 ships that had congregated outside the Galapagos Islands fishing for squid, I saw that there were several Indonesian crew on board one of these squid boats. And I proposed to the journalist that we put our small boat in the water and he interviewed them. This was about a year and a half to almost 2 years after COVID-19 had been declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization. And when when the Indonesian fishermen found out that the journalist was from the United States, almost 2 years after the pandemic was declared, this Indonesian fisherman who told the journalist that he was abused on board the ship, that he felt stuck on board the ship, and he asked the journalist from the United States if COVID had made it to the US yet, almost 2 years after it had. And that's because for almost 2 years, he'd been stuck on this boat with no access to outside news, with no ability to communicate with family members at home. And it's just the industrial fishing operators out there are only able to operate by exploiting labor. And so with these campaigns, we're saving animals, we're protecting the marine environment, and we're also fighting for social justice. And for me, that's like a holy trinity of good work that convinces me that this is the right way forward for the organization.
Yeah. Something I've heard you say before that I guess it makes sense when you think about it, but we don't often spend time thinking about it, is, that like the fishing industry, it's easier to launder fish than it is money. And it, completely makes sense because it's such a, I suppose you could say it is regulated to some extent, but, that it's not as well enforced as other industries, like illegal industries are. So, yeah, it's really hard to think that, a lot of the time these vessels and operations go completely under the veil of secrecy. Like we would have no idea.
Usually crimes occur when 3 categories are met. And one of those is that it's incredibly lucrative. You can make a lot of money doing it. There's very little risk of getting caught. And even if you do get caught, the penalties are very low. So if somebody in Melbourne decides to go rob a bank, right? The bank gives up the money to the bank robber, and the government insures the deposits of the, like, no Australian citizen loses money in the bank robbery, right? Because it's all insured. That's not to say that the people at the bank aren't traumatized and that this doesn't affect them for the rest of their lives and this isn't a brutal, violent act. But the money is largely untouched because of insurance. But if you and I got together and we bought an industrial trawler and we decided to take it to Liberia, and we decided to fish illegally in an area that is normally fished by a local artisanal fishing community of people making $70 a month, and we completely destroy these people's livelihoods, like essentially wipe out a community of 7,000 people, and we were to get caught, we're not going to prison for the 10 to 20 years we would get for the bank robbery. We would ultimately get a fine. And that's why we need to see the penalties increase. It's one of the reasons why the trafficking of wildlife products in a lot of areas in the world has outstripped the drug trade. If you get caught moving narcotics through Southeast Asia, you go to prison for the rest of your life. In some places, you get the death penalty. You move rhino horn or ivory tusk, you're looking at 2 years, 4 years. The value of ivory compared to the value of cocaine by weight, the ivory is now more valuable. And so we need to see greater enforcement and greater deterrence. And I think it's one of the things that our patrols off the African continent help achieve is that deterrence effect.
Yeah. And, I guess for people who aren't aware of that model, you're working with government, like I believe that Sea Shepherd provides like the vessels and some of the staff, like just explain how that works.
It's a true partnership. It's essentially what you would call in the Navy a ship rider agreement. So we provide the ship, we provide the crew, the engineers, the deck officers, the navigators who run the vessel. Our generous donors provide the fuel, and our government partner provides the law enforcement agents, the people from the Coast Guard or the Navy or the Fisheries Authority or the National Park Authority, the people with the authority to board, inspect, and arrest ships. So we provide the transportation, we provide training that allows the law enforcement authorities to get to the scene of the crime and to actually do something about the poaching problem.
So there really has to be a partnership with the government to be able to, really work together. But also, like you said as well, they need to have a focus on, really then enforcing what is, if they do find something, penalizing people or businesses that are involved.
So, but before the chase of the Thunder, I knew nothing about fishing, right? I was a whale guy. And I thought, like many people, that fishing vessels could go out to sea and find fish kind of anywhere. And what I would come to learn is that fish congregate around seamounts and continental shelves and coastal areas, which means that 90% of the fish killed around the world are killed in the waters of countries, which means that there is a national authority and there is a regulatory framework to enforce the law. So if we're serious about addressing illegal fishing, and for me, addressing illegal fishing is a route to addressing overfishing and fishing in and of itself, then we have to start with illegal fishing, and we have to start by working with governments. We can't just go into the waters of Liberia or the waters of Gabon or the waters of Benin, 3 of our country partners, and get the work done unless we have the government on board as a partner. And that is what gets the tide to turn. And I think it's incredibly inspiring that a lot of this big conservation change, it's not coming from Europe or the United States or Australia. It's countries we're partnered with around West Africa that are leading the charge on a lot of issues like shark conservation.
Yeah, it's really exciting. And so what would you say, how, like, to people that might be listening to this that want to be able to help, want to get involved, like what are the different ways that we can do that?
So a lot of our crew are volunteers on board the ship, and that's certainly how I started. And for my first 4 or 5 years with Sea Shepherd, I was a volunteer. And so people can go onto our website, seashepherdglobal.org or seashepherd.org.au if they're based in Australia. And they can submit a crew application, and maybe I'll then have the privilege of sailing with them at sea. Maybe I'll have the privilege of sailing with you, Alicia. We also are entirely funded by donations. So I would hope that people could donate to get our ships at sea, to get them to stay at sea. But if you're unable to volunteer your time at sea, or if you're unable to donate, and there's a possibility of volunteering on shore. And we have onshore chapters around the world, especially in Australia, where our incredibly passionate onshore supporters do outreach, getting the news out there about what's happening to marine animals, what's happening to the marine environment, while also raising funds for Sea Shepherd. And then I think it's the responsibility of every person to look at their own complicity in what's happening at sea, and to see where they might be aghast about what's happening, what happened with the Levico 2, the vessel I mentioned earlier that was killing endangered deep sea sharks for cosmetics. And that's because a lot of cosmetics have squalene in it, which is a fancy word for shark product, right? For shark liver oil. And unless that product says that it's plant-based squalene, we have to make the assumption that the squalene came from shark. From that to looking at what we eat, and as I mentioned before, I've been vegan for 21 years, and it's something that I've never regretted, and it's one of the things that I'm the most proud of, and it's really at the base and foundation of every other action that I take.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many ways that we can help, even if, we're not able, like you said, to be on a ship or be in a certain country where you are providing direct action. There's so many things we can do from, from our lounge or from our local community, which is fantastic. And, you've spoken about the projects you're currently working on, but is there anything, in the future that is up and coming for you that you might like to share?
I think we've shown what we can really accomplish working in the national waters of our country partners, and that working with now 8 country partners, we've assisted those countries to arrest 83 vessels and counting, which is just an amazing success. But to ensure that the poaching problem doesn't just move from one country to the next, we're now looking at doing regional patrols. And so we're having law enforcement agencies from several countries on board at the same time, and that allows these countries to exchange lessons learned, and also ensures that the vessel can move across borders, ensuring that there's nowhere for the poachers to hide. We've created this really successful model around the African continent. I would love to bring it to other parts of the world, including Latin America, including the South Pacific, including places much closer to Australia, where, because of the Antarctic campaigns, I've spent a substantial amount of time, and Australia is a country that's very close to my heart. And I would love to see our supporters in Australia continue to support the work we've been doing around the African continent, but also to support conservation efforts that are closer to home as well. So that's my hope, is to bring this model global.
Yeah, wonderful. And I guess before we finish up, first of all, is there anything that you did want to mention that we might have missed? I feel like we've covered a lot, but in your huge career, I'm sure there's lots of things we could have covered.
I think because I've been a part of the vegan movement, I am part of the vegan movement, but I've been a part of it for such a long time. I think I've always felt that fish get the least amount of advocacy and the least amount of attention, even though twice as many fish are killed as all other animals combined. And I think we need more fish advocacy. I think if we're looking at confronting the idea of speciesism and the discrimination on species, I think that even within our own community, fish fall victim to that, because they are the animals least like us. They don't have eyelids, they don't blink like mammalian species do, like pigs and cows, which for some reason makes it so that we are less empathetic to them. They don't have vocal cords like us because they breathe through gills instead of lungs, and as a result of that, their screams are silent, and yet every scientific study seems to indicate that they have the same capacity to suffer as you or me. And yet in most vegan outreach material that I come across, fish tend to be on the last page, either an afterthought or a footnote. And yet I think in terms of maximum amount of lives that we're able to save, we need to have a tremendous focus on that. And then what I've seen in over 2 decades of being involved both in conservation and in animal rights, I think Sea Shepherd is a great bridge between those 2 communities. And I think we need to have greater cooperation and collaboration between the animal rights movement and the conservation movement. I find that we're often working in our own bubbles and in our own spaces, and yet we have more in common than we have things that divide us. And I would love to see this movement grow. And I would love to see this movement be about more than social media and be about establishing real communities in the real world, pushing for significant social change. And then lastly, I think activism has to be sustainable. And for activism to be sustainable, we have to have practical goals and milestones along the way. And I think there's a tendency within both animal rights and conservation to always be focused on the long-term goal. For example, mitigating climate change, which is such an abstract concept, and the opposition is so large that we can easily feel discouraged, and we need successes along the way to build a movement and to keep momentum going. And so that's why we need to focus on things like what a huge movement of people did, including Sea Shepherd Australia, in stopping drilling offshore in the Great Australian Bight. We need concrete campaigning goals to get people going, to keep people moving, and the activism has to be sustainable, because a lot of these problems, unfortunately, probably won't be solved in our lifetime.
And I guess that is a question I'd be interested to know, like, how do you, I'm guessing at times, especially when you're out at sea for numbers of days or months, at times you could almost lose a little bit of hope, or, struggle with the burnout of doing what you do day to day. So, do you have certain strategies, or I guess like what's your motivation to keep going?
I always bring it back down to the level of the individual animal, right? And there's an old saying, and I think it comes from Judaism, that if you save a life, you save the world. And so there are times when I've set foot on illegal fishing vessels, and because of the presence of our government partners, that ship is arrested and it's shut down. And every day that ship spends in port, if it's a trawler, could be 50,000 animals saved a day. And for me, that's fantastic. But it's like when I mentioned the 2 million lives saved by the arrest of the Libico 2. A figure that big, it becomes abstract, right? People don't know what to do about numbers that big. If I say 73 to 100 million sharks are killed every single year, it doesn't resonate with the public in the same way as seeing the suffering of an individual creature. When I'm on board an illegal fishing vessel and that ship gets shut down, it reinforces for me why we make the sacrifices that we do and why it's all worth it. And so the challenge then becomes when you set foot on board a legal fishing vessel, and this legal fishing vessel could be as destructive as the illegal boat. It could even potentially be more destructive than the illegal vessel. And yet they do have their paperwork in order, and that's the difference, right? Or they weren't in the prohibited area, or their mesh size was the right size, or whatever it is that had them in compliance. And the vessel ultimately has to be released, and it's the knowledge that that ship is going to keep plundering the seas. And it's not something that I talk about regularly, but I'll share it with you. And so many of these vessels have bycatch, which is the animals that are killed other than the target animals. And whenever I'm on the deck of any ship, and I whether legal or illegal, I always take 2 fish and I always throw them overboard and watch them swim away. And one of the fish is for my partner Emma, who is so understanding of the amount of time I have to spend away from home. And one of the fish is for my dear friend Trix Wallen, a partner of Philip Wallen, another dear friend who is well known in the animal rights movement in Melbourne. And so even if this ship is released, I go back to my ship and I lay down in my bunk and I think, even if this ship was released, 2 fish swam away today. And if I don't think that that is victory enough, then I'm not focused on the animals and I'm focused on myself. And at the end of the day, 2 fish were saved. And sometimes that has to be good enough. And that's what I mean about focusing on the long-term goals of, we got to end illegal fishing, right? But at the end of the day, from today till the day that I die, if I save 1 animal, it's a life worth living. And that's what I try to focus on.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I think, that resonates with a lot of us because we can often feel overwhelmed. Like in this community, you can feel overwhelmed by the
Mhm.
suffering that you see or the things that you know and learn about. But it is really important to be able to focus on what we can do. And like you said, in your case, every animal that you save, that's their entire world for them.
Yeah, it's we have to keep bringing it back to the animals every single time. That's what we're doing it for, right? We're not doing it for ourselves. We're not doing it for our own identity, or like, we are doing it for the animals. And that's why for me, effectiveness has to be the metric that we always look at in terms of the tactics that we choose. Is what we're doing the most effective thing we can be doing with our time in ending animal suffering? We always have to bring it back to the animals. That's what I try to do, and that's what keeps it sustainable.
Yeah.
I think we're so bad in the animal rights community and in the environmental movement to actually celebrate the successes that we do get. Like, there are successes. When I became vegan, I would have to get in a car and drive 30 minutes to the Chinese supermarket to buy powdered soy milk to make. Now I go into a supermarket in Los Angeles where I live, and I hear the new wave of young vegans complaining because there's soy milk, oat milk, almond milk, macadamia milk, hemp milk, but for some reason, in a great sense of injustice, this particular supermarket doesn't have flaxseed milk. And I always silently think to myself, you do not know how good you have it and what the people who came before you had to go through just to get powdered soy milk. So, but that kind of perspective and looking how far we've come in just 20 years is something we need to do a lot more of.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Peter. I'm so grateful. You have no idea. And I'm sure that this community will be so excited to listen to your episode and also follow along and see, what's the best way. I know that Sea Shepherd has a great social media, also your website and newsletter and things that people can sign up to follow along with campaigns.
The best thing to do if their supporters are in Australia is to follow Sea Shepherd Australia at seashepherd.org.au, to follow the work of Sea Shepherd Global, which is managing the global fleet of ships and the ships that many Australian supporters are familiar with, like the Bob Barker, which we unfortunately had to retire last year, but the Age of Union, formerly the Sam Simon, the Ocean Warrior, the Sea Eagle, the ships that are out on the front line saving marine wildlife. And they can follow on Instagram, they can follow on Twitter, and hopefully people will become monthly donors as part of our Direct Action Crew program, and then they get updates that don't necessarily go to the public. And so I would certainly encourage people to become a monthly donor. That's what allows us to budget for these campaigns, and that's what allows us to turn generous donations into lives saved.
Well, thank you again so much. So, so grateful for this opportunity. And yeah, I'm excited that this is the 100th episode, but also as well your 20th year. So thank you so much. We've both celebrated and I'm very grateful.
Thank you so much, Alicia. I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about Sea Shepherd, to talk about fish, and it's a real privilege for me to celebrate our joint anniversaries together. So thank you so much for having me on the show.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.